I want to talk to you about where we've got to with COP, but can we look at some of the remaining questions from the Owen Paterson fallout before we do that? Because there are quite a few still remaining. Now, the government has admitted the vote to try and overturn that verdict on Mr. Paterson's lobbying, that he broke the rules, was a mistake. But your former party leader and the former Prime Minister John Major, who I know you don't agree with on everything, went a bit further to suggest that Boris Johnson's administration was politically corrupt. Now, you've said already this morning that you think this whole thing is a storm in a teacup. Why so?
Well, because the first thing is we weren't voting in that amendment to overturn, as you put it, the verdict on Owen Paterson. What we were voting for in that amendment was to establish an appeals process. And I think there's
And
a
suspend
general,
the verdict against him.
well, until you've had the appeals process. But principally, it was about establishing that appeals process. We think that's the right thing to do, but it turns out obviously you can only do that with cross-party agreement. In the event, other opposition parties made clear that they were not going to engage in that discussion at this juncture because they felt it would get conflated with the issue around Owen Paterson. So we withdrew it. So look, with hindsight, yes, it was a mistake to bring that forward in the way we did because there was a risk it would get conflated with the Owen Paterson case, and indeed that's what's happened. And once we realised that, we withdrew it. So I think the reason I think it's a storm in a teacup is it is one of those things. It's around a parliamentary process, around a disciplinary procedure. We were attempting to bring forward an appeals process. It turns out now's not quite the right time to do that. But we will be revisiting this because I think there is a view that there should be such a process, an appeal and due process in future.
Well, let's get on to that because I really want to dig into the substance of all this because it is quite important. But just on your words, storm in a teacup, I mean, I do have to remind you that some 100 of your fellow Tory MPs didn't vote for this. Either they rebelled by voting against it or they just refused to vote altogether. They abstained. I've talked to several ministers who were extremely happy, some in the cabinet very unhappy at having to do this. And it was all because they thought the government was trying to bend the rules out of shape to get off one of their own, protecting one of their own. That is quite a serious charge. And some say it does indeed warrant the definition of corruption, not a storm in a teacup.
Well, look, as I said, I don't agree with John Major on a lot of things, and certainly not on this particular thing. We've basically admitted that we made a mistake by bringing this forward. That's why we withdrew it again. It turned out that although the vote was carried, there were a significant number of colleagues on our own backbenches that were uneasy about that. And that's, the government's always got to be able to be connected to and in tune with its backbenches. And so it was the right thing to do to withdraw the motion that we had put forward the previous day.
Do you think that you've lost some trust with the public as well? Clearly your backbenchers are pretty angry with you. What about the British public? Do you think this has filtered through?
Well, look, I don't know. The reality is polls go up and down, and I've seen some polls today. The truth is, though, I think for the public at large, what they are most interested in is coming out of this pandemic, concerned about their incomes and jobs. And so we've got the fastest growing economy in the G7, and we've been very successful at getting the vaccine rollout to date and more to do on boosters. These are the sorts of issues, I think, that are occupying the minds of the public at large, not these sorts of Westminster storms.
Okay. Can I just put this point to you, though? It's not really an isolated incident, though, is it? What you might call a Westminster storm and a row about process and whether rules are being followed. Because this Prime Minister, of course, went on holiday to Mystique without properly declaring who paid for it. That's been a ruling from the Standards Commissioner as well. Then there's the highly irregular way in which his number 10 flat refurbishment was paid for. There's been a lot of criticism against that. Then there was Sir Alex Allen's verdict, the independent advisor on ministerial standards on Priti Patel's bullying. He was ignored, so he resigned. The Prime Minister ripped that up. And of course, he tried to keep Matt Hancock in his job after rule breaking, which he then went on to resign for. I mean, would you at least accept, Mr. Eustice, and this might be part of his strength, that this Prime Minister does things a little differently?
Well, I think what is the case is that he doesn't believe in throwing people under a bus for what you might judge to be sort of minor errors of judgment. And in that sense, yes, he's very different to someone like Tony Blair, who used to, I think, threw Peter Mandelson under the bus 3 times for not much reason. And so I think he's got he's very loyal and doesn't believe in being bounced into doing the wrong thing and treating people badly for the wrong reasons. But look, I also don't really accept the comments you made around the flat, because the truth is that when it comes to the Downing Street flat, that's been looked at. The civil service have looked at that, and whether he made the right declarations and so on. And Lord Guy looked at this and came back and concluded that he did.
We've talked about that, but just what you said there about this Prime Minister is not one who believes in throwing people under the bus for minor errors of judgment. Now, a lot of your colleagues, I'm sure, might think that's a good thing. Are you saying in this instance all Owen Paterson did was a minor error of judgment?
Well, look, as an MP, there are it's quite normal and accepted that you can have interests and financial interests that you disclose and declare in the normal way, which Owen did. And there's no bar on you raising issues with knowledge that you might have from life that you might have outside of politics. There's no bar against that. You just have to declare that interest. But there's obviously then a separate rule, which is you can't do direct paid advocacy. And there was a line there that in this instance the parliamentary committee judged Owen had overstepped. Now, I don't think Owen would have intended to do that. I think it was just an error. He throws himself into things very passionately and with a vigor. At the time that he did this, he wouldn't have thought that he was breaching any kind of rules. He would have felt, I'm sure, that he had declared an interest and was raising a legitimate issue that he had come across through the course of his business.
Okay, well, let's move on to the actual substance here, because I think people do care about whether Westminster is corrupt or not and how MPs' standards are and how they're held to account. You still want to reform the current system for policing MPs' conduct, I believe, which is, of course, overseen by the Parliamentary Commissioner for Standards, Catherine Stone, at the moment. It does also appear that you are rather unhappy with Catherine Stone herself. In fact, some of your colleagues think she has a bit of a vendetta for whatever reasons against Brexit or something. Do you sign up to that?
Well, I don't know her. I've never come across her. I've never had any dealings with her, so I can't really. I haven't got any particular reason. As far as I'm concerned, she's appointed there to do an independent role, and obviously, the work that she does go to a parliamentary standards committee as well to be sort of signed off and agreed. So there is one check on it in that instance. But I'm afraid I don't know her personally, and certainly from our point of view, this is not about her. It is about establishing an appeals process so that MPs have got a right of appeal, right to make their case and be heard.
So you're happy for her to continue in her job because the business secretary, your cabinet colleague, Kwasi Kwarteng, has said she should consider her position?
Well, I think my understanding, I didn't see, but I've had read to me this morning in other interviews the comments that Kwasi Kwarteng made. It seemed to me that he was talking about the role of the commissioner and how that would fit in a new process where you would have an appeal rather than the individual. He didn't name her and say that she should consider her position. He was talking about what the role of a commissioner role might be in a future system.
Well, are you happy for that role to continue, for the role of Parliamentary Commissioner for Standards to continue, albeit with perhaps an appeal system thrown, or should this reform be wider and a lot bigger as far as the government is concerned?
Well, look, I think one of the lessons of last week is it's not really for me or the government to say this is what the system should be. It's actually for Parliament on a cross-party basis to discuss these matters. And so we've learned that lesson. We withdrew the motion that we put forward last week. What we still hope to do, in the weeks and months ahead is actually open a dialogue with the other parties about how the current processes can be improved so that there's more accountability and so that there is that right of appeal, which is normal in any other walk of life.
This all began, of course, with a finding against Mr. Patterson for lobbying repeatedly for companies who were paying him rather a large sum of money. Now, there is a grey area here, isn't there, on second jobs that MPs have? And I think a lot of people might look at it and say, well, if you're a lawyer, practicing barrister, or a doctor, practicing in the hospital, which some of your colleagues do at the same time as their parliamentary duties, that's obviously a useful thing for them to be able to do. But the area of consultancy work, which could easily slip into lobbying without any of us really seeing. And as far as Catherine Stone thought did for Owen Paterson, that's a really messy area, isn't it? Would you like to see MPs' second jobs pared back a bit?
Well, I think the important thing here is sometimes if people have directorships and experience of business or maybe trustees of charities and so forth, you shouldn't hold against them the fact that in those other roles, they will come across things that they can see aren't quite right or could be changed or could be improved. In Owen's case, to be fair, he'd raised a case around food safety linked to a particular antibiotic in milk he felt he was doing the right thing in highlighting that. He'd come across it through a different role, and he was highlighting that. But there is a boundary, but it is a grey boundary between having interests from which you might benefit with external knowledge that you can bring to bear in your role, provided you declare those interests, and that's what all members of Parliament do. There's a boundary between that and being a sort of paid advocate and using the role to advocate. And in this case, that's what the Commissioner and the Parliamentary Standards Committee
Yeah,
concluded that Owen had done, that he'd overstepped that
but if
that
that
line.
boundary is grey, as you just said, surely the rules should be better defined.
Well, it may be that from this, that the rules such as that could be looked at. But obviously, at the moment, the opposition parties have said they're not willing to entertain a discussion in this area. So for now, I think we have to accept that things won't change. That we're stuck with the system that we have. But in future, obviously, we could have probably a better process with an appeal mechanism. Perhaps yes, with a bit more clarity about where the dividing line is between having an interest that you declare and which is normal and accepted and actually sometimes beneficial, to having a role as a paid advocate, which is not, which crosses the line.
Okay, that's very interesting. Finally, on Mr. Patterson, he said he wants to continue in public service. Would you like to see him continue perhaps in the House of Lords like other ex-cabinet ministers get?
Well, he's been very clear that he wants to continue in public service, but not in politics. And so he couldn't have been clear about that. He's leaving the cruel world of politics, as he put it. I think wants to spend time with his family. I think we all respect that. And therefore, I think it's highly unlikely that he'd return to the Lords.
Highly unlikely, or should he not be allowed to? Because that's what Labour's asking for this morning.
Well, look, I don't make these decisions, but I suspect it is highly unlikely that would happen.
Okay, one final point, Lobbing, because I want to move on to COP. Is it just a coincidence that peerages have been offered to all 16 people who donated £3 million plus the Conservative Party and held the title of treasurers? The Sunday Times reports this morning.
Well, the point is that in all of those cases, these are philanthropists who've made great contributions to charity, yes, who also have an interest in politics and are engaged in politics, but are also very successful in business. And so have something to bring to public life, have something to bring to the House of Lords. And I don't see anything wrong in that. We do have a system where political parties raise money privately, and in the case of Labour, it's from the trade unions, and in the case of Conservatives, yes, we do get donations from individuals who support our cause, and I think that's better than the alternative, which is state-funded political parties. Political parties play an absolutely vital role in our democracy. In fact, it couldn't function without all of those volunteers and the voluntary donations that people make. So we shouldn't make that a sort of a barrier to entering public life, because you've actually got people here who are philanthropists, who support charities, but have an interest in politics, and we should be welcoming that.
Let's move on to COP. That's where you are now. We've got 6 really crucial days coming up before Friday's deadline to get an agreement. Greta Thunberg, as you'll know, has already described COP26 as a failure because she says world leaders have created loopholes and shaped frameworks to benefit from themselves. Some people have called it a 1-1 messy draw so far. What's your prognosis of where we are?
I actually think it's been a positive start, and in the time I've been here, I've talked to some people, other ministers who are veterans of COPs, have been to, in some cases, the last 20, and they tell me that this one is really positive. It's different for one key reason, and that is not only are we getting some substantial pledges, 90% of the world's economy committed to net zero, 120 countries coming together this week to pledge to halt deforestation by 2030. It's not just the pledges, which it's always the easy bit, that the money's there too. We've seen the US double their commitment to international climate finance. We've seen some £15 billion of funding brought to bear to help end deforestation and support projects in those areas. So I think it's been a really positive start. There's more to do. There's another week of negotiations to sort out, but we shouldn't be cynical about this. And, Greta Thunberg has been saying it was all a failure before it started, and we're halfway through. She's saying the same thing, and no doubt we'll say the same at the end. But I've equally come across lots of youth activists at the conference who are engaged really constructively, taking part in panel discussions, having their voice heard.
Okay, let me put a couple of specific issues to you because these are areas you could push for in this agreement. One is the idea of a ratchet. So every 5 years, all the parties, all 196 countries have to report back on how well they're doing on climate change. But some people want to bring that forward to every 2 years or every 3 years. So in other words, we wouldn't have to wait till 2025. We could do this all over again in 2023. Will the UK government push for that to be in the COP agreement?
Well, look, obviously, at every COP, there's a review on what was done before. So a lot of what's being discussed, yes, is reviewing and trying to convert some of what was pledged at the Paris Agreement, but then some of the other subsequent agreements as well. There's follow through on some of those, particularly around oceans and everything. So we've. There's always that option. I mean, our
But
negotiators at
do you
the
want
moment
it?
are working
Would
on.
you push for that option, though? Because it's very much within your gift.
Well, the lesson of these multilateral negotiations is that nothing's particularly within your gift. I mean, there's lots of things that we're pushing for, but our priorities that we've been pushing for are to get a really big commitment on nature and on the role of nature-based solutions. And I think we've been very successful in this first week of doing that. Commitments on transport and electrification, that's to be discussed next week. Really big part of the agenda. Some commitments on coal, and we have got 100 countries to commit to phasing out coal as an energy source. So we're making good progress. I'm not sure about whether this sort of technicality around a ratchet is something that we would push for or would be in the final text, but it's often the case that when you have these annual events, that's sort of implicit anyway, and there's a lot of referring back to previous agreements.
Okay, that may disappoint some, but listen, Caroline wants to come in. I just want to ask you about one other big issue in the news at the moment, and that's the allegations of racism over Yorkshire Cricket Club. Now, Azim Rafiq, who's the cricketer who launched the allegations against Yorkshire, has said this is wider than just one club. He says racism is still institutional as a problem in sport. Do you agree with him?
Look, I think in this case, obviously, it was unacceptable, and we'll just, the ECB, I know, have got involved in this. They've made clear that they would suspend, Yorkshire from being able to host international events and so on. And it does seem now that actions being taken. I think the ECB have taken this very seriously. I know that government colleagues in DCMS have met the ECB as well to discuss this matter.
Morning, George. It's Caroline here from the Sunday Times. I'm just wondering, it seems that sewage is also back on the agenda. It's not just sleaze. And the Environment Bill is going to return to the Commons on Monday. Are you finally going to accept the Duke of Wellington's amendment? Or are you going to bring forward something of your own? And how is that going to meet some of the concerns raised in the upper house?
Yeah, essentially, we've tabled a better drafted amendment that delivers the same things that the Duke of Wellington's amendment was trying to achieve. I mean, on this issue, we've argued consistently for a very long time that we want to reduce the use of CSOs. We gave instructions in a new policy statement to Ofwat earlier this summer that should be hardwired in the next pricing review. The bill already had huge numbers of commitments for a plan to phase out CSOs and to significantly reduce their impact, a requirement for water and drainage plans. But look, there was a lot of interest in this particular amendment. So there will be an amendment from us that we've tabled that has a direct requirement on water companies to reduce their reliance on these CSOs. And it highlights the power of the Secretary of State through the Water Industry Act to be able to enforce that. So I think that many of our MPs, certainly who had concerns on this area, will welcome the fact that we've essentially done what was in the Duke of Wellington's amendment.
But is it going to go far enough? I mean, there's been a real concern about how strict that duty is going to be on water companies to avoid sewage discharges into rivers, and people feel very passionately about that. Can you give a cast iron guarantee that this will stop that practice from happening?
Yeah, well, it does everything that the Duke of Wellington's amendment did. And so he recognised that this is a challenge that you wouldn't solve overnight because the cost of removing all of these storm overflows could be up to £600 billion. But that's not to say that we shouldn't significantly reduce their use. And since the 1960s, most houses have been on the surface water drainage has been on a different drainage system to the foul water sewage system. But often they've ended up being plumbed back into the sewer further downline. And it may be that there's some interventions that can be made that make a big difference, even though they wouldn't necessarily remove all of these CSOs overnight. So the Duke of Wellington recognised you wouldn't do this overnight. That's why his emphasis was on making a significant reduction in the use of these CSOs, and that's what we're going to be mirroring in the amendment that we've tabled.